November 20th, 1945, Nuremberg, Germany. 76 years ago, in the cavernous wood-paneled courtroom of the Palace of Justice, the most monumental trial in history commenced. The Nuremberg Military Tribunal, established by the victorious Allied powers, the Soviet Union, the United States, Great Britain, and France, was set to pass judgment on the masterminds of the Third Reich. Before the world, the surviving titans of the Nazi regime, the architects of a war that had consumed the globe and unleashed unimaginable horrors, were called to account. One by one, men like Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, and Joachim von Ribbentrop faced the bar of justice. Most would be sentenced to death, their names forever etched into the annals of infamy. Yet, as the list of the condemned was read, a conspicuous name was absent. It was the name of the man whose revolutionary ideas had given the Nazi war machine its terrifying speed and lethality. The man who had forged the Panzer divisions into a world-conquering sword. The father of the very concept of Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. That man was General Heinz Guderian, born 1888, died 1954. How could the architect of Germany's most stunning victories, a figure as central to the Wehrmacht's initial triumphs as any other, escape the hangman's noose? The answer lies in a remarkable journey, a story of a brilliant military visionary, a stubbornly insubordinate commander, and a man whose frequent and furious clashes with Adolf Hitler ironically became his saving grace. This is the story of Heinz Guderian, the man who was fortunate enough to be forgotten by justice. The shadow of Rommel and the mind of a visionary. When one thinks of the German Panzer Corps, of the relentless advance of tank treads across the plains of Europe and the sands of North Africa, the name that immediately springs to mind is Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. His daring, his battlefield charisma, and his legendary exploits have cast a long and romanticized shadow over the history of World War II. Because of this, the man who truly laid the foundation, who conceptualized the weapon Rommel wielded so masterfully, is often relegated to a footnote. That man was Heinz Guderian. Guderian was not, in the mold of Rommel, a pure frontline, swashbuckling field commander. He was, first and foremost, a thinker, a theorist, a military intellectual whose mind operated on a strategic, almost philosophical level. He was a staff officer par excellence, a man who saw not just the tank, but the entire ecosystem of modern mechanized warfare. To put it simply, without Guderian, there would be no Panzer arm as the world came to know it. Without his relentless advocacy and intellectual rigor, the doctrine of Blitzkrieg might never have evolved beyond a fringe theory into the devastatingly effective reality that brought Europe to its knees. The seeds of his revolutionary ideas were planted in the mud and stalemate of the First World War. Guderian, a young officer, experienced firsthand the senseless, static slaughter of trench warfare. He saw armies of millions grind against each other for years, gaining mere yards of territory at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. This horrific inefficiency burned itself into his mind. He understood that the machine gun and the trench had given the defense an overwhelming advantage. To win the next war, a new way had to be found to restore mobility and decision to the battlefield. His journey through the post-war Reichswehr, the 100,000-man army permitted to Germany by the punitive Treaty of Versailles, was formative. He served not in a glamorous combat role, but in the unglamorous but vital fields of signals and logistics. As a communications officer, he grasped the absolute necessity of reliable, real-time command and control. He saw that if you could make your forces react faster than the enemy, you could get inside their decision-making cycle. As a logistics and transportation officer, he learned the sinews of war, fuel, ammunition, and supply. He understood that an army could only move as fast as its support could follow. These two experiences, the need for communication and the realities of supply, would become the twin pillars of his Blitzkrieg concept. The wilderness years, forging a sword in secret. Throughout the 1920s, a decade when Germany was ostensibly disarmed and pacified, Guderian's mind was furiously at work. The Treaty of Versailles forbade Germany from possessing tanks, aircraft, or heavy artillery. Yet, in the shadows, Guderian and a small cadre of forward-thinking officers began to dream of the future. He devoured the writings of foreign military theorists, particularly the British thinkers J.F.C. Fuller and B.H. Little Hart. Fuller envisioned great fleets of tanks operating independently, striking deep into the enemy's rear to paralyze their command structure. Little Hart advocated for the indirect approach, using mechanized forces to hit the enemy where they were weakest, causing a strategic dislocation that would lead to collapse. Guderian absorbed these ideas, but he added his own uniquely German and intensely practical spin. He realized that the tank alone was not enough. To create a truly revolutionary force, the tank had to be the centerpiece of a combined arms team. This was his great conceptual leap. In a 1929 paper, he laid out his radical doctrine: the tank as the decisive arm. Tanks should not be scattered among infantry units as mobile support pillboxes as most other armies envisioned. They must be concentrated in their own powerful divisions, Panzer divisions, to act as the mailed fist, the primary striking force of the army. The combined arms team. To support the tanks and exploit their breakthroughs, every other element had to be mechanized to keep pace. Infantry would ride in armored half-tracks. Artillery would be self-propelled. Engineers and supply columns would be fully motorized. Every component of the division would move at the speed of the tank. Command and control. Every single tank, from the platoon leader to the division commander, must be equipped with a radio. This was perhaps his most critical and overlooked innovation. While other armies saw radios as a luxury for high command, Guderian saw them as the nervous system of the Panzer division, allowing commanders to react instantly to changing battlefield conditions, to coordinate attacks on the move, and to concentrate their forces with a speed and flexibility their opponents could not fathom. Air-ground coordination. Guderian was an early and passionate advocate for close air support. He envisioned dive bombers like the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, acting as flying artillery, clearing the path for the Panzers and terrorizing enemy defenders just ahead of the main armored thrust. These ideas were nothing short of heresy to the deeply conservative Prussian officer corps that dominated the Reichswehr. Generals weaned on the infantry-centric tactics of World War I saw Guderian as a dangerous radical, a tank-mad fanatic. They scoffed at his exercises, where he used cars and motorcycles with cardboard mock-ups to simulate his panzer divisions. His proposals were ridiculed, his requests for funding denied. He faced a wall of opposition, a stubborn refusal to see the future he so clearly envisioned. Guderian fought relentlessly, his abrasive, impatient personality earning him many enemies. He was on the verge of being sidelined, his revolutionary concepts destined to gather dust on a shelf. And then, in 1933, everything changed. A fateful alliance, Hitler and his Panzer general. When Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party seized power, they brought with them a revolutionary fervor that shattered the old order. Hitler, a former corporal who despised the aristocratic caution of the traditional general staff, was inherently attracted to new, bold, and aggressive ideas. He promised to tear up the Treaty of Versailles and rearm Germany, and he was searching for weapons and doctrines that promised swift, decisive victories, avoiding the protracted trench warfare he had loathed. When Guderian was finally given the chance to demonstrate his ideas to the new Führer, the connection was electric. Hitler watched a demonstration of Guderian's motorized units performing high-speed maneuvers. He saw motorcycles, armored cars, and light tanks moving in concert with an unprecedented speed and coordination. At the end of the display, a visibly thrilled Hitler turned to Guderian and declared, "Das ist was ich brauche. Das ist was ich haben will. That is what I need. That is what I want." In Hitler, Guderian found the patron he desperately needed. The Führer poured resources into Guderian's project, overriding the objections of the old guard. In October 1935, a year after Germany officially renounced the Treaty of Versailles, Guderian, and along with Colonel Oswald Lutz, was tasked with creating the first 3 Panzer divisions. The dream was becoming a reality. By 1938, Guderian, now a lieutenant general, was personally leading his new Panzers as they rolled into Austria during the Anschluss. His creation was no longer a theoretical model. It was a functioning, powerful military force organized into corps-level formations, ready to serve as the cutting edge of Hitler's ambitions. The Blitzkrieg machine was ready for war. Unleashing the storm, the apex of lightning war. Poland, September 1939. The world watched in shock. Guderian, commanding the 19th Army Corps, unleashed his doctrine with stunning effect. His panzers didn't just fight the Polish army, they sliced through it. They bypassed strong points, drove deep into the rear, and encircled vast formations before they even knew what was happening. In just 4 days, from September 1st to 5th, his corps had shattered the Polish defenses in the Polish corridor. The losses were astonishingly light: 150 officers and 700 men. Within a month, Poland, a nation with a large and brave army, was crushed. Guderian's Blitzkrieg was no longer a theory, it was the most potent military doctrine on earth. For his role, he was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, a testament to the success of his long and arduous struggle. France, May 1940. This was to be his masterpiece. The Allies, Britain and France, expected a repeat of World War I. They massed their best forces in Belgium, anticipating a German attack through the northern plains, and hunkered down behind the supposedly impregnable Maginot Line, a massive chain of concrete fortifications. Guderian was a key architect of the audacious German plan, the Sichelschnitt, sickle cut. He argued that the heavily forested and hilly Ardennes region, considered impassable for tanks by the French High Command, was in fact the perfect route for a surprise attack. It was a colossal gamble. On May 10, 1940, Guderian's Panzer Corps, part of a massive armored concentration, plunged into the Ardennes. What followed was one of the most decisive military operations in history. The Panzers emerged from the forest, crossed the Meuse River at Sedan, and shattered the weak French forces holding the line. Then, Guderian did what no one expected. He turned west and raced for the English Channel. His superiors, cautious men like his immediate commander, General Paul von Kleist, were horrified. They feared his flanks were exposed and repeatedly ordered him to halt and consolidate. Guderian, incandescent with fury and the certainty of his vision, famously defied them. In a heated argument with von Kleist, he threatened to resign his command on the spot. He was convinced that to stop was to lose the momentum that was the very soul of Blitzkrieg. He pushed his men and machines to the breaking point, driving day and night. On May 20th, just 10 days after the invasion began, his lead tanks reached the English Channel at Abbeville. He had cut the Allied armies in two, trapping the entire British Expeditionary Force and the best French armies in a pocket with their backs to the sea at Dunkirk. France, a great military power, was brought to the verge of collapse in less than 2 weeks. After the campaign, Guderian was promoted to Generaloberst, Colonel General, a rank equivalent to a 4-star general. He was the father of the Panzer Force, and he had delivered Germany its greatest victory. The unraveling on the Eastern Front. Operation Barbarossa, June 1941. When Hitler turned his attention eastward to invade the Soviet Union, Guderian's Panzer Group II, later the 2nd Panzer Army, was once again the tip of the spear. The initial phase of the invasion was a string of breathtaking successes. Guderian's forces executed massive encirclements at Minsk, Smolensk, and Kyiv, capturing millions of Soviet prisoners and destroying thousands of tanks. The Blitzkrieg seemed unstoppable. But the Soviet Union was not France. The vast distances, the poor roads, and the sheer tenacity of the Red Army soldier began to take their toll. As autumn 1941 approached, a fateful strategic debate erupted. Guderian, along with most of the senior commanders, argued passionately for a direct, all-out push on Moscow. They believed that capturing the capital, the political, industrial, and transportation hub of the nation before winter set in, would cripple the Soviet war effort and lead to its collapse. But Hitler became obsessed with other objectives. He overruled his generals, ordering Guderian's panzers to turn south to assist in the encirclement of Kyiv. While the battle for Kyiv was another stunning tactical victory, it was a strategic catastrophe. The diversion cost the Wehrmacht a precious month of good weather. By the time the drive on Moscow was resumed in October, it was too late. The autumn rains turned the roads into impassable rivers of mud, and then came the winter. It was a winter of apocalyptic cold, the likes of which the German army was utterly unprepared for. Guderian, always a commander who led from the front, saw the horrifying reality with his own eyes. He flew to Hitler's headquarters to report in person. His men were freezing to death in their summer uniforms. The oil in the tanks was turning to solid grease, rendering the engines unable to start. The cold was a more formidable enemy than the Red Army. He pleaded for permission to conduct a strategic withdrawal to more defensible lines to save his army from annihilation. The response from the Führer, safe in his warm command bunker in East Prussia, was an unequivocal and furious no. Hitler, haunted by Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, issued his infamous "Stand Fast" order. Not one step back. Armies were to hold their ground to the last man. For Guderian, this was the breaking point. The clash between the professional soldier, focused on military reality, and the fanatical ideologue, driven by sheer willpower, became an open conflict. He continued to argue, to protest, and even conducted limited withdrawals against direct orders to save his troops. This insubordination was the final straw. He clashed violently with his superior, Field Marshal Günther von Kluch, and on December 26, 1941, Guderian was dismissed from command by Hitler. He was sent into the Führer Reserve, effectively fired and put on the shelf. The architect of the Blitzkrieg was cast aside at the very moment his creation was freezing to death outside the gates of Moscow.
A general in the shadows. For over a year, Guderian remained in disgrace. But by 1943, with the disaster at Stalingrad, Germany was in desperate need of his expertise. He was recalled not to a field command, but to the post of Inspector General of Armored Troops. In this role, he worked closely with Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, to rationalize and increase tank production. He was instrumental in overseeing the development and refinement of new tanks like the formidable Panther and Tiger. He was still a powerful voice, but he no longer commanded armies in the field. His influence was felt in training, organization, and production, but the strategic direction of the war was firmly in Hitler's hands. During this time, he had a significant disagreement with Field Marshal Rommel over the best way to defend against the impending Allied invasion of France. Rommel wanted the Panzer reserves positioned close to the coast to smash the invaders on the beaches the moment they landed. Guderian, ever the proponent of mobility, argued this would make the tanks vulnerable to the overwhelming Allied naval and air power. He believed the Panzers should be held back in a central reserve, ready to launch a massive, decisive counterattack once the main Allied landing site was identified. Hitler, as he often did, opted for a disastrous compromise, scattering the divisions in a way that satisfied neither strategy. After the failed assassination attempt on Hitler on July 20, 1944, Guderian's position became even more complicated. In the aftermath, he was appointed Chief of the Army General Staff. However, the role was a hollow one. He had little real power to direct operations. He also accepted a seat on the Army Court of Honor, a tribunal that summarily dismissed hundreds of officers accused of involvement in the plot, stripping them of their military status so they could be tried and brutally executed by the Nazi People's Court. His participation in this process remains a dark stain on his record, an act of accommodation with a murderous regime. Throughout this final period, his arguments with Hitler became legendary for their ferocity. Reports describe shouting matches where Guderian would bluntly contradict the Führer on tactical and strategic matters. This constant friction culminated in his final dismissal. In March 1945, after a particularly explosive argument over a failed counterattack, Hitler screamed at him, "Your physical health requires that you immediately take 6 weeks sick leave." It was the end of his military career. The reckoning and the quiet aftermath. On May 10, 1945, with the Third Reich in ruins, General Heinz Guderian surrendered to American forces. He was imprisoned and interrogated, but as the preparations for the Nuremberg trials began, his case presented a conundrum for the Allies. He was undoubtedly a key figure in unleashing the war. His military doctrine had made Hitler's conquests possible. Yet his evidence of his career painted a complex picture. He had been dismissed by Hitler in 1941 for advocating a retreat. His final years were marked by ceaseless, bitter conflict with the Führer. The Polish government demanded he be tried for war crimes committed in Poland, but the Western Allies, particularly the Americans and British, were hesitant. They tended to view him as a brilliant, if difficult, professional soldier rather than a rabid Nazi ideologue. He had not been directly involved in the administration of the Holocaust or other genocidal policies. His crimes were seen as primarily military, not political or genocidal. Ultimately, it was his reputation as Hitler's opponent that saved him. By clashing so publicly and so frequently with the dictator, he had inadvertently created a firewall between himself and the regime's worst atrocities. He was never indicted. After 3 years in captivity, Heinz Guderian was released in 1948. He returned to a quiet life in West Germany, and in 1950 he published his memoirs, Panzer Leader, Erinnerungen eines Soldaten. The book became a bestseller and was hugely influential, especially in the West. It provided one of the first detailed, high-level German accounts of the war on the Eastern Front and cemented his legacy as the father of armored warfare. He also consulted with the builders of the new West German army, the Bundeswehr, contributing his ideas to the defense of Europe during the Cold War. Heinz Guderian died of heart failure on May 14, 1954, at the age of 65.
The legacy of a flawed genius. Heinz Guderian remains one of the most significant and controversial military figures of the 20th century. He was a genuine visionary, a man who saw the future of warfare with startling clarity and fought against a calcified establishment to bring his vision to life. His concepts of combined arms mechanized warfare changed the face of the battlefield forever. Yet his genius was placed at the service of one of history's most monstrous regimes. While he may have seen himself as a professional soldier, separate from politics, that separation is a dangerous illusion. His ambition and his singular focus on perfecting his military machine made him a willing and indispensable tool for Adolf Hitler's conquest of Europe. He built the sword, and he was the first to wield it. His story is a profound and cautionary tale. It is the story of a brilliant innovator, a stubborn and insubordinate commander, and a man whose personal conflicts with his supreme leader ironically shielded him from the ultimate judgment of history. He was the ghost at Nuremberg, the architect of the storm who was not there when the bill for the wreckage came due. He was, in the end, the fortunate man whom history, in its complex and often inscrutable way, chose to forget.